And my name is Christina May. I work in the Corps' Baltimore District, and I am the environmental lead for the South Atlantic Coastal Study. And I would like to thank all of our stakeholders for joining us today for the SACS Environmental Webinar, where the team will be presenting the priority environmental areas. So here is the agenda for today's webinar. In the first part of the webinar, we will be an introduction that will include the purpose of the webinar as well as team introductions. Then I will discuss some background on the SACS environmental analysis, including a brief overview of the environmental resources vulnerability and inundation risk analyses and the process to identify the priority environmental areas. The majority of today's webinar will be the environmental team presenting the priority environmental areas by each state and territory in the SACS study area. There will be an opportunity for questions after each state and territory presentation, as well as an open discussion at the end of the presentation. We will end the presentation by discussing next steps and provide information on how you can provide feedback on the priority environmental areas. So the purpose of today's webinar is for the SACS environmental team to present the priority environmental areas by state and territory and explain the criteria used to identify these areas. We would also greatly appreciate any feedback you have on the priority environmental areas during today's webinar, as well as any feedback after the webinar once you've had a chance to review the information. So now we're going to do team introductions. Like I said, my name is Christina May. I work in the Corps Baltimore District, and I'm the environmental lead on this study. Now I'm going to pass it over to Justin.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Justin Bashaw. I work for the Corps' Wilmington District, and I am the environmental lead for the North Carolina portion of SACS. Bethany?
Good morning, everyone. This is Bethany Ward. I'm a biologist in the Charleston District, and I am the environmental lead of South Carolina State Appendix. And now I'm going to pass it over to Steve.
Good morning. My name is Steve Fox, and I'm a biologist for the Savannah District Plain Branch, and I'm part of the SACS environmental team. And we're working on vulnerability, risk determination, as well as now determining our priority environmental areas for our Georgia reach as well as our focus areas. And off to you, Paul.
Good morning. My name is Paul DeMarco. I'm an environmental lead in the Jacksonville District, and I'm working with my colleague Darren on the Peninsular Florida portion of the South Atlantic Coastal Study. On to you, Darren.
Hi, my name is Darren Pecora. I'm a biologist up here at Jacksonville District, working and assisting Paul DeMarco with the environmental portion. Off to you, Kat.
Hi, I'm Kat McConnell, and I am a biologist and the environmental lead for the Mobile District. And the areas that I'm working on are the Florida Panhandle, Alabama, and Mississippi reaches. And back to you, Christine.
And Jason is on the phone if you would like to introduce yourself, Jason.
Okay, thanks, Christina. I'm Jason Hales. I'm an environmental scientist with CDM Smith, and we're assisting the Corps of Engineers with the Puerto Rico and U.S. Virgin Island Appendix. Thank you.
And Jason will be available for questions on Puerto Rico and U.S. Virgin Islands, and I will be presenting the information for the territories. Okay, so next we're going to do a virtual poll, and we would like to know how many of you were able to participate in the SACS Environmental Resources webinar on July 28th. During this webinar, we presented the SACS environmental analysis and the web mapping tool. So we just wanted to see how many of you were able to participate in that webinar. So please take a moment to check the appropriate box. All right. So it looks like a lot of you were able to participate in our webinar on July 28th. Some were not, it looks like. For those of you who were not able to participate in our previous webinar, the webinar notes and slides can be found on our SACS website at the link shown here if you're interested in looking at those. And this slide also has the link to our SACS environmental web mapping tool if you're interested in looking at that as well. And we will be sending out these links in an email following this webinar. So this slide shows the SACS placemat, and the placemat provides a brief description of all of our key study products And as you can see, the environmental analysis and identification of the priority environmental areas, which I have highlighted in yellow there, is just one product of this large watershed study. And this is what we are going to be presenting to you today. I did want to point out one other product on this slide, and that is the focus area action strategies. Some of you may have participated in the ongoing focus area workshops to develop the focus area action strategies for the 21 focus areas located throughout the study. The environmental team has identified priority environmental areas within and outside of the focus areas. So during their presentations, the environmental team will identify which priority environmental areas are located within the focus areas. And the priority environmental areas located within the focus areas may be included in the focus area action strategy, where risk reduction measures and strategies will be developed. The priority environmental areas located outside of the focus areas will not have risk reduction measures identified. However, all of the priority environmental areas, whether they're within or outside of the focus area, will be included as recommendations in the SACS report for follow-on studies or actions. So I just wanted to give a brief overview of our SACS environmental analysis. It won't be the in-depth overview we presented on July 28th, but just a refresher, a little refresher to go over the environmental analysis. So this slide shows the definition of vulnerable environmental resources for the South Atlantic Coastal Study. Congress directed the Corps to identify opportunities to address risks in areas with vulnerable environmental resources. And since the term vulnerable environmental resources is broad, the SACS environmental team narrowed down the definition for our analysis. Consider vulnerable environmental resources to be natural areas or features. So next, I'm going to briefly discuss the environmental resources vulnerability analysis. And the first step was the environmental team identified the natural areas located within the SACS study area in their state or territory, and they placed each natural area into the most appropriate NOAA CCAP land cover class. And CCAP stands for Coastal Change Analysis Program. Each environmental team member scored the vulnerability of each CCAP class in their state or territory to coastal storm hazards, including storm surge inundation, erosion and wind, as well as inundation and saltwater intrusion from sea level rise. Each CCAP class was then identified as having a low, medium, or high vulnerability based on a formula that the team developed. So to develop the vulnerability map, NOAA's Cat 5 maximum of maximum slosh inundation layer was used to clip the CCAP data to the Cat 5 maximum of maximum footprint. And the CCAP land cover classes were then reclassified from their CCAP class value to a vulnerability score. So this slide shows a snapshot from the vulnerability map. The green represents low vulnerability, orange is medium vulnerability, and red is high vulnerability. And the vulnerability scores for each state and territory, as well as the vulnerability map, are located on our SACS Environmental Resources web mapping tool in the link that I showed in a couple of slides ago. And we'll be sending that link out in a follow-up email if you want to take a look at that. So the next step was developing the environmental risk map. So to do this, the vulnerability indices were multiplied against the SACS Tier 1 combined hazard plus sea level rise. And the hazard index depicts inundation probability. The 3 feet of sea level rise was added in a bathtub approach to the 10% and 1% annual chance water levels. So this slide shows a snapshot of the inundation risk map. And again, the green represents potential low risk, the orange represents potential medium risk, and the red represents potential high risk. And again, this inundation risk map is also located on our SACS Environmental Resources web mapping tool. So the inundation risk map and other regional and state data and information were used to identify the priority environmental areas. So each team member will present the data and information they use to identify their priority environmental areas in their state and territory. So this slide shows the vulnerability map and the inundation risk map along the coast of Mississippi. And the 2 focus areas in Mississippi are outlined in black on the map. So as I stated on the previous slide, the hazard used in the risk map was inundation. And some naturally inundated areas were identified as having a potential low risk in the risk map, as they are able to adjust to fluctuating water levels. However, it is important to note that these natural areas rank high on the vulnerability map because they may be vulnerable to other hazards such as increased salinity, erosion, and sedimentation. So we just thought it was important to point out the difference between the vulnerability and the risk map. I also just wanted to say that we did receive some great comments on our environmental analysis and our web mapping tool, and the team is currently reviewing those comments. So next, we are going to move into our priority environmental areas. And the first state we're going to do is North Carolina, and I'm going to pass it on to Justin.
Okay, thank you, Christina. For each state or territory included in the South Atlantic Coastal Study, focus areas were selected. So on the left-hand image here, you'll see every focus area for the entirety of the SACS. And I'll refer to the South Atlantic Coastal Study as SACS for the remainder of this portion of the presentation. In that left-hand image, the focus areas have relatively high overlap of socioeconomic, infrastructure, environmental, cultural resources, and other disciplines that SACS is assessing in terms specifically of coastal storm damage and sea level rise. So in North Carolina specifically, in the right-hand image, there are 3 focus areas. Dare County to include Ocracoke, which is actually in Hyde County, Carteret County and Craven County, and New Hanover County and Brunswick County. Most of North Carolina's coastal areas Most of North Carolina's coastal areas are contained within one of the identified focus areas, but not all. So for this reason, most of the identified environmental priority areas happen to be contained within a focus area as well. So as many of you are already aware, environmental risk in North Carolina is being assessed primarily using 3 tools. The SACS Tier 1 Exposure Assessment Viewer on the left-hand side of the screen, which you've all likely seen, or many of you have likely seen, includes an Environment, Cultural, and Habitat Exposure Index tab that incorporates nationally or regionally cohesive data. The data under this tab can be further refined to display only an environmental or cultural index, and the environmental index is color-coded so that the most at-risk areas, most vulnerable areas, are featured in reds and orange. The middle image, the environmental story map image here, is what Christina had touched on earlier, and that uses matching of North Carolina habitat types to NOAA CCAP classes for mapping purposes, and then assigning a vulnerability score and color coding that score as a low, medium, or high for each class. When those vulnerabilities are combined with sea level rise projections, we're able to visualize an approximation of the environmental risk throughout the state. And third, in the right-hand image, we see the North Carolina Natural Heritage Program's online mapping tool, which has proved quite useful. This tool is a hub of sorts and includes a large volume of information ranging from conservation areas to biodiversity and wildlife habitat assessment to coastal wetlands and more. The most useful data layer for this study may be the natural areas layer, which we actually see in the right-hand image. According to the Natural Heritage Program, these data identify terrestrial and aquatic sites that are of special biodiversity significance. The locations where these 3 tools intersect provide a starting point for the identification of environmental priority areas in the state. However, identification is also considered factors such as the management status, the use by threatened and endangered and other rare species, and other factors beyond just simple map overlap. So there are currently 14 identified priority environmental areas in North Carolina. And to reiterate, these areas were not identified just by overlap of mapping, but did include the other factors like management status, use by threatened, endangered, and rare species, and other factors. So with respect to everyone's time today, the slides to follow will further discuss only 2 of these 14 North Carolina priority environmental areas, strictly in environmental terms, meaning no conflation with other interests such as cultural resources or socioeconomic interests, and I'll provide brief reasoning for their selection. So here we see the Cape Hatteras National Seashore. This was selected for a number of reasons, but principally it contains almost 25,000 acres, 70 miles of ocean beach, sand dunes, shrub thicket, deciduous evergreen, mixed forest, a good deal of the different habitat types. currently managed by the National Park Service, contains a lot of habitat for a variety of different animals, including reptiles, birds, and mammals, provides critical habitat for piping plover, especially in summer months, and nesting habitat for 5 endangered sea turtle species. Vulnerability speaking, salinity changes resulting from coastal storms and or sea level rise can change habitats, especially on the Pamlico Sound side of the seashore through rising water levels and or physical disruption. Coastal storms may alter the existing habitat through erosion or storm surge, or may redistribute sands, such as capes can be expanded or reduced, inlets may be created or closed, which may not be unexpected, but would certainly change the existing habitat there that is known to be of great significance. Sand redistribution may also significantly change the available habitat types and associated acreage for threatened and endangered species. Are there any other questions specifically relating to this selection, the Cape Hatteras National Seashore? The other area I chose to highlight as a priority North Carolina area was the Cedar Island National Wildlife Refuge. Reasons for selection are similar but not the same. Contains about 14,500 acres of maritime shrub marsh, brackish and freshwater, cypress gum swamp, bay forest, lococosin, pine pond wetlands, and longleaf pine, coastal fringe, sandhills habitat. A lot of different habitat types in a currently protected area, managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Those habitats that I had mentioned earlier provide a variety of habitat, forage and nesting for birds, reptiles, over 250 species of birds actually, including the endangered red-cockaded woodpecker and a variety of mammals. The refuge marshes are some of the most important locations for black rails, which happens to be a species of special management concern in the state of North Carolina. And vulnerability-wise, sea level threatens to inundate or eliminate wetlands and introduce otherwise saline conditions to areas that do not currently have salt-tolerant vegetation, which may lead to a phenomenon commonly known as ghost forest, where we have just dead stands. Coastal storms may also alter existing habitat through erosion, storm surge, and high wind events. I'd love any other questions on Cedar Island as a selectee for an environmental area in North Carolina, a priority environmental area. But if that's not the case, I'd like to move forward to Ms. Bethany Ward for South Carolina.
Thanks, Justin. And this is Bethany Ward again with the Charleston District, and I want to thank the great South Carolina contingency that is on the phone with us today. I can see you all entering your identification into the chat, so thanks for coming alongside with us today. So Christina and Justin have already explained the process that went into using the Tier 1 data and the scoring of the vulnerability of our natural resources that we went through, and how that information was combined with storm surge and sea level rise projections to result in a score that indicated whether those natural resource areas were at low, medium, or high risk to inundation impacts. For the South Carolina analysis, I wanted to let you all know that the main information source that I started with was the 2015 South Carolina State Wildlife Action Plan, in order to understand what kinds of habitats are found in coastal South Carolina and why they are considered important for our fish and wildlife populations. And that formed the basis for my vulnerability scoring. Once the risk assessment was completed, I looked more closely at all of the high-risk areas and, in some cases, some of the high-medium risk areas. And the additional information that I used to select out some areas that could be considered a priority included whether they were designated as critical habitat for listed species. I also looked at natural heritage sites and wildlife management areas. Similarly to North Carolina, South Carolina also has a Heritage Trust program, and these identify important lands that have been conserved because they are considered outstanding representations of our state's heritage. I also considered information that was provided in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Planning Aid Report, particularly with respect to national wildlife refuges. I considered other protected lands in the state, especially those that are used by state or federal listed species. And I looked at other people's priorities. This was mainly to confirm the priorities that I was identifying. It wasn't to try to repeat the strategic processes that these other entities have gone through, but to see if my priorities overlap with other people's priorities. And finally, I use some of my own professional judgment, just having lived and worked in South Carolina for a long time and having worked with many of our stakeholders. To some degree, I tried to anticipate what you all might identify as priorities, but we can discuss that some more. So in South Carolina, there are 2 planning reaches for the SACS study. Planning Reach 3 extends from the Little River at the North Carolina-South Carolina border down to the Santee River at the Georgetown-Charleston County line. Planning Reach 3 has one focus area, the Grand Strand, which is actually a little larger than the Grand Strand. It actually extends down through Murrells Inlet down to Debadew. And using the information that I described on the previous slide, I've identified 4 priority natural resource areas as high or medium-high risk in Reach 3. 2 of them, Huntington Beach State Park and Brook Green Gardens, are within the Grand Strand focus area. The Waccamaw National Wildlife Refuge and the Tom Yawkey Preserve lie outside of the focus area, but are part of the very important Winyah Bay watershed. The other planning reach in South Carolina is Reach 4, and it extends from the Santee River down to the Savannah River at the South Carolina-Georgia border, and it has one focus area covering the Charleston metro area. For this planning reach, I have called out 8 priority areas for natural resources, for a total of 12 for the state of South Carolina in the SACS study area. 3 of the 8 priority environmental areas are actually in the focus area, and these include Charlestown Landing, Cypress Gardens, and Bird Key Stono Seabird Sanctuary. The remaining of the priority areas lie outside of the focus area, generally away from our population centers. These include the Santee Coastal Reserve, Cape Romaine, DeVoe Bank Seabird Sanctuary, Botany Bay, and Hunting Island and St. Philip's Island State Parks. So as an example of one of the priority areas for South Carolina that I've identified is the Santee Coastal Reserve. It is made up of 4 different islands at the mouth of the Santee River, 2 of which are barrier islands. So across the 4 islands, it really provides a diversity of habitat, including tidal freshwater wetlands and managed impoundments. There's also bald cypress swamps, as well as upland longleaf pine and mixed hardwood forests. And then we have beach dune systems on the barrier islands that are designated critical habitat for loggerhead sea turtles and piping plovers. The various habitats of the reserve also support a wide range of wildlife species, including a large population of American alligators, hundreds of species of birds, including the red-cockaded woodpecker, and 25% of the state's breeding population of wood storks are found here. The location of the reserve is also important for supporting conservation corridors because it is surrounded by other protected land. It connects to the Francis Marion National Forest to the west, the Cape Romaine National Wildlife Refuge to the south, and other state protected lands to the north and up the river, which is also important because the Santee River is designated critical habitat for the anadromous Atlantic sturgeon. The reasons why this area is a priority is because of the high risk of alteration of these important habitats from potential salinity changes and erosion that could come with storm surge and sea level rise to a system that's already experiencing tidal erosion and threatened by invasive species. Impacts could result in degradation, fragmentation, and loss of habitat for a number of critical species because of the diversity of habitats and species that are found there. In the interest of time, I've only highlighted one priority area today for you, but I'm happy to take any questions on the South Carolina natural resource priority areas at this time, and then we'll move on to our other states and territories.
Hey, Bethany, this is Debbie. So I don't know whether you or Christina want to handle this question we got in, but I think it's a good question to help folks understand what the difference is between a priority area, a focus area, and reaches.
Christina, do you want to tackle that? I'm happy to, but...
Sure. So the focus areas are areas of high risk. They were identified by our SACS Tier 1 risk assessment, and the indices used in that assessment were population infrastructure, environmental and cultural, and social vulnerability. And then we did a Tier 2 analysis to kind of refine those focus areas. The priority areas are focused on environmental only, so they don't take into account population infrastructure or social vulnerability. And then the planning reaches, I don't know the exact definition of and how we defined our planning reaches, but that is basically, in Bethany, do you have any insight on the planning reaches?
Well, so that was that's the first layer of how the SACS study was divided up, and so and they to some degree cover the different jurisdictions, different. It allowed the different jurisdictions of the Corps to work within our state jurisdictions, and it was sort of a way to divide up the state. Even though it's a regional project, we have all the districts in the South Atlantic Division working across the within our jurisdictional areas. But then I think the plan reaches, since our states were rather large and included a lot of coastline within the SACS study area, I think the reaches were also divided maybe on major ecosystem boundaries or maybe on TNC boundaries. I can't quite recall, but that's how the reaches within the states were divided. So first we have the states, and they're divided into planning reaches. And then within the planning reaches, we have some focus areas that are sort of looking across those multi-sectors, as Christina mentioned, those are the focus areas, and the stakeholders some of you have been participating in our focus area meetings, helped us identify those focus areas. And then the priority natural resource areas are what we're talking about today. Some may lie within the focus areas and some may lie without.
And Justin provided a response, it looks like, in the chat. So like I said previously, you can have priority environmental areas within a focus area or outside of a focus area, and those located within a focus area could be addressed in that focus area action strategy that the districts are working on.
Thank you, ladies. That was the only question we had, but I thought it was a good one before we kept talking about those terms. So
yeah, that is a really good question.
Yeah, so just real briefly, there is a planning reach for every part of the coastline, but not every part of the coastline is a focus area, and not every priority area is within a focus area. So it does get a little confusing, but there are some overlapping circles, but there is a planning reach for every part of the coastline in the study. So, all right, back to Bethany, or on to the next.
So before, I just want to make sure there weren't any specific questions about South Carolina before we moved on to Georgia.
None that I saw.
Okay. Okay. I'm going to pass it over to Steve Fox.
All right. Well, thanks, Bethany. Well, as stated, I guess next slide, please. Well, as stated prior, our focus areas are a project assessing several resources like socioeconomic, environmental, and cultural resources against the effects from storm damage and sea level rise. So in this slide to the left, you can see again our areas in North Carolina and Alabama, and on the right you have the entire Georgia Reach border in purple, as well as our two focus areas, those being Chatham and Glenn County. So for Georgia, like other SACS study areas, we essentially use the same format to establish our CCAP classification for each habitat, as well as in determining our vulnerability and risk factor scores. So for the risk metrics, as stated prior, the vulnerability indices are multiplied against the Tier 1 combined hazard plus sea level rise to identify potential risk areas. Those scores are then applied to the risk analysis layer on the SACS-JS mapper. And then, as you see on this slide here, risk areas are binned in 3 classes, low, medium, high. So determining our priority environment areas, we first have established a criteria framework. The Georgia team utilized criteria shared by the SACS environmental team, as well as regionally specific criteria. For Georgia, one of the criteria that we used was natural areas to support migratory birds. Chatham County, for example, is one of several counties in coastal Georgia that contain habitat that has been designated an area of hemispheric importance for the survival of threatened shorebird species like pike and plover. Our barrier islands also support approximately 30% of the shorebird population. Other criteria to consider were critical habitat for threatened endangered species. For example, our Bear Islands not only serve as important nesting areas for several sea turtle species, but also serve as critical habitat for loggerhead sea turtles in particular. Other criteria included unique ecotypes and natural landscapes that provide specific habitat for listed plants and animal species to flourish, like longleaf pine savannas, depressional wetland communities, sandhill and beach dune communities, Spartina marsh, and maritime forest. In addition, several areas had exceptional vulnerability and risk in sea level rise, and they were also considered. For example, the entire eastern stretch of Wassa Island Refuge, including both north and south points, lie in a high-risk area. Criteria is also accomplished in several ways. In addition to utilizing the risk analysis layer on the GIS mapper, we also refer to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife IPAC tool to evaluate critical habitat and listed species. We also utilize natural places layer on our GIS mapper to evaluate areas of natural importance. So here's a first draft list of 25 priority environmental areas we've selected for Georgia, with 13 in the focus area and 12 in Georgia reach. As you can see, the list is pretty varied, includes city, county, and state parks, federal refuges, and public preserves like Cannons Point and Quality Preserve in St. Simons. Amazing place if you haven't been there. And several public beach areas. So this is one of the great examples of our priority environment areas. This is Cumberland Island, and definitely one of my favorite places to go birding, camping, and hiking on the Georgia coast. This location arguably had most, if not all, the criteria we evaluated, from unique and pristine habitats, like having over 9,800 acres of designated wilderness, to critical habitat for threatened endangered species, to being an important shorebird location, as well as migratory stopover for piping plover and red knot, and also having a high rating for risk and vulnerability. Cumberland Island is prone to storm damage and erosion as a whole, but more so in the south end in particular, where normal sand shifting deposition can be amplified through storm damage and sea level rise, thus having lasting effects. This can pose impact not only critical turtle and bird habitat, but also pose a risk to critical naval activities conducted from nearby Kings Bay. Additionally, any changes in salinity as a result of sea level rise can permanently alter dune, beach, and marsh habitats throughout the entire island. So Cumberland Island is just one of the several priority areas we considered. As stated prior, we had several, but to keep it concise and short, we're just sticking with this one. Keep in mind, this is also a living document, so input from everyone is very important. That's all I have for now. Any questions?
Thank you, Steve. So, like you said, a couple people asked, are these will all the priority areas be in the report? And as we stated, yes, they will all be in the report. The only ones that may have further actions addressed will be those those priority areas in the focus areas. We also received a question on sea level rise, which I'm going to ask Drew Condon, our engineering lead for this study, to answer. And it asks, will sea level rise be included in higher res AdCirc, which is a model analysis, or is it just added to the 1% and 10%? Drew, could you address that question, please?
Yes, sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, good. I want to make sure I was unmuted. Yes. So the coastal hazard system, which is one of the products on the placemat that was shown at the beginning, in that higher res numerical model, and there will be sea level rise added into the modeling. So it's not just going to be a bathtub model, but the nonlinear effects will be included. So there will be runs at present day sea level, at a 100-year out on the intermediate curve, USACE curve, and 100-year out on the high USACE curve. So there'll be 3 different sea level present and then 2 future sea levels that will be modeled.
Thank you, Drew. I didn't think I should throw that on one of our environmental folks to answer. Appreciate you being willing to step in for that. All right, that was the only question I saw. Those are the only 2 questions I saw. So thank you very much.
Okay.
Great. Well, great. If there are no other questions, I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Paul DeMarco.
Thank you, Steve. Good morning. My name is Paul DeMarco. I'm an environmental lead for the Jacksonville District, and I'm working with my colleague Darren on the Peninsular Florida portion of the South Atlantic Coastal Study. As you can see from the screen, there are 7 planning reaches in Florida, preliminary planning reaches for the SACS study. FL6 through FL12 are what we are talking about today. I will briefly discuss the tools we use to identify the priority environmental areas within these 7 reaches, and then Darren will share a map and list of these areas, as well as a case study. Okay, to help us identify priority environmental areas in Florida, similar to the rest of the other SACS teams, we used 3 web mapping tools and additional criteria listed on the bottom of the screen. The first tool on the left is the SACS Tier 1 Exposure Assessment Viewer. And this helped us identify habitat areas at risk to sea level rise and coastal storm damages. The middle of the screen is the environmental risk map, and this is the map where we applied the NOAA CCAP classes, the Coastal Change Analysis Program, the CCAP, to habitat types that we'd identified in the Tier 1 Exposure Viewer. So then we assigned vulnerability scores to the habitats based on their susceptibility to factors such as saltwater inundation, storm surge, erosion, and winds associated with coastal storms and sea level rise. On the right of the screen is the third online tool we use, which is a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services product. The IPAC is a project planning tool. This helped us identify the wetlands and listed species occurrence in some of these areas that we are already narrowing in on: critical habitat, migratory bird occurrences, and other important biological resources. And then the additional criteria to further refine these lists of priority areas, we did use the Fish and Wildlife Service Planning Aid Report for the South Atlantic Coastal Study, which summarizes biological resources and habitats vulnerable to sea level rise and storm activity in the southeastern United States. In addition to the planning aid report, we reviewed some management plans that we could find for specific areas to help characterize the vulnerable state and federal lands, not necessarily discussed in the planning aid report. We also assessed the significance of these areas, national and state level significance, whether they're state parks, national wildlife refuge, designated critical habitat, or undeveloped areas. And then we assess the ecosystems, goods, and services provided by these areas, such as wave attenuation, storm damage reduction, or if it had commercial or recreational fisheries values. And then we did also use a little bit of best professional judgment.
Hi, good morning. This is Darren Purpura again, working with Paul on Peninsula Florida SACS reaches. So this map shows priority environmental areas within Jacksonville District 7 planning reaches. The pins represent individual refuges, parks, preserves, land set-asides, and land set-asides that were identified using the tools that Paul explained earlier. You can see a high concentration of pins on the west coast of Florida, for instance, around Charlotte Harbor, Tampa, and up towards Crystal River. These areas have a high volume of vulnerable coastal land set-asides, but some are a little bit smaller in size. However, they met our criteria and are considered a priority. I also wanted to point out the lone pin near the tip of southwest Florida. This represents Everglades National Park. The area looks sparse with pins, but this represents a huge landmass. Finally, some areas of the state are more developed than others, such as the southeast coast. So, in fact, there are less land set-asides in this area. So this planning reach has some less vulnerability. In the next 3 slides, there will be a list of 31 priority environmental areas that we identified with a total of 120 sub-areas. This consists of national wildlife refuges, state forests, parks, and preserves, and so on. Starting at the top of the list, there are 6 priority environmental areas identified in the Northeast Coast Planning Reach FL06. Within individual priority areas, multiple sub-areas were identified and grouped together, which are interconnected habitats within the watershed or in close proximity to one another, having some connectivity, such as Anastasia Island State Park, Matanzas State Forest, and Pillister Creek. There are a total of 14 sub-areas within the FL6 planning reach. Multiple focus areas overlapped our priority environmental areas, as you can see on the right-hand column. A highlighted at-risk habitat in this reach includes extensive saltwater marshes north of Jacksonville and the Temecula Preserve, and the intercoastal just south of the city, and also the area south of there, the GMT Research Reserve. These marshes support a wide range of plants and animals and serve as a nursery area for the region's fisheries. On the east central coast, the FL7 planning reach identified 5 priority environmental areas with 13 sub-areas. We also grouped priority areas and named them as complexes, such as Canaveral Complex, which I'll use an example in a bit. Next is planning reach FL8. It's the southeast coast of Florida that includes 5 priority areas and 12 sub-areas. Planning reach FL9 is the Keys and West Glades area of Florida. This includes 6 priority areas with 14 sub-areas. Highlighted habitat at risk of sea level rise includes tropical hardwood hammock, which is a globally threatened habitat type. These diverse forests are home to hundreds of plants and animals. And on Key Largo, this includes a federally listed Key Largo wood rat, Key Largo cottonmouth, Stock Island tree snail, American crocodile, and an eastern indigo snake. Planning reach FL10 is southwest Florida, which includes 4 priority environmental areas and 28 plus sub-areas. Mangrove and coastal northwest Glades region within this reach include the Greater Everglades habitats stretching from the Caloosahatchee River south to the 10,000 Islands and inland to Everglades National Park. This is a vast area with a range of species and habitats which are low in elevation and are at risk to sea level rise. Studies are currently underway in this area looking at the effects of sea level rise. Planning reach FL11 is west central Florida. This includes 4 priority areas with 29 sub-areas. Highlighted habitats in the Crystal River complex include the area's mosaic of forests, coastal marshes, mudflats, oyster bars, mangrove islands, spring-fed rivers, and seagrass beds. This area supports large populations of migratory birds and waterfowl, as well as manatees, which forage on freshwater macrophytes and coastal spring-fed rivers, which may be affected by sea level rise. The habitats also support significant recreational and commercial fishery. Finally, planning reach FL12, which is the northwest Gulf Coast of Florida. Priority areas were lumped together with 10 sub-areas total. Also known as the Big Bend, this is the largest remaining stretch of undeveloped coastline in the continental United States and supports a wide range of habitats and species. So I'm going to give you an example of one of our priority environmental areas from the East Central Planning Reach FL7. This is the Cape Canaveral Complex. It's a network of several federal and state managed lands and areas. Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge, Kennedy Space Center, Cape Canaveral National Seashore, Mosquito Lagoon Aquatic Preserve, and Banana River Aquatic Preserve. This area was chosen due to the environmental vulnerability of species and habitats to sea level rise, coastal storm damages, and erosion. Some of the critical habitats include Florida scrub, pine flatwoods, beach and dune habitat, also freshwater and estuarine marshes and wetlands. Species include nesting loggerhead, green and leatherback sea turtles, which are common while Kemp ridleys and hospital are found occasionally nesting. Gopher tortoise, eastern indigo snake, Atlantic salt marsh snake, and southeastern beach mouse utilize the dunes and forest. There is critical manatee habitat and foraging areas for sea turtles and aquatic preserves in the Back Bay. ESA-listed birds also utilize this area, such as scrub jays, red knot, piping plover, and wood stork. Also, other migratory birds and waterfowl are abundant. A few endangered plants also occur. Collaborations between agencies help drive successful conservation efforts here. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is responsible for management of Kennedy Space Center lands, activities such as prescribed fire and upland management for scrub jay habitat have had success. The significance of this multiple use area goes without saying. And thank you. Questions, please?
Yes, so we have two questions. The first question is Cape Canaveral Air Force Base is not included in the Cape Canaveral complex. We've had this question in the past. Christina, do you want to cover that question, or would you like me to try to answer that?
Yeah, if you or Darren could answer that, that would be great.
So a lot of our military bases you will not see in these priority environmental areas. Our military is going through a different process to identify their priority areas, and we are planning to hold a webinar with them within the next month or so to talk about the tools that we have available. So any military base lands you will not see included, but that does not mean that they don't have an issue coming up. It's just a different method for them to accommodate that. And then the next question was Pinellas County Aquatic Preserve wasn't explicitly listed. Darren, can you answer that one?
Yes. Let's take another look at the area. We tried to pull out as much as we could, and we can still reconsider some of these areas. I would appreciate some more, feedback on that. It's a large state, so
some of our aquatic preserves may not be showing as well because some of the items that make them really special may not be as vulnerable to a sea level rise. But there are two noted there, Pinellas County and Biscayne Bay, and Darren and Paul will look into those and get back to everybody on the reasons they were or were not included. So it could have been part of a complex that the name was just left out.
Yeah, Biscayne Bay the whole area was listed as a priority area with Biscayne Bay National Park, so it just needs to be, annotated, but it is included.
Okay, those are the only questions I thought for that one. So on to our next speaker. Darren, you're going to introduce that person, I believe.
All right, off to Kat McConnell for Mobile District's responsibilities.
Thank you, Darren. I'm Kat McConnell, and I'm a biologist in the Mobile District, and I am going to be talking to you today about the Panhandle of Florida, Alabama, and Mississippi. Next slide, please. So my analysis used the methodology that was described by Christina, and other members earlier. And I also incorporated some data sets from the state, such as the Florida Natural Areas Inventory land cover and their descriptions, as well as state-listed species data. But I really want to focus in on the results of that analysis because I think you guys have had it drummed into your head as to what those methods were that we used to come up with this priority environmental areas, locations, and analysis. So what we're looking at right now is Reach 13, and I broke it into two, east and west, because it's a fairly large reach. It is the entire Panhandle. And so the Florida Panhandle Reach 13 East has one focus area, which is Panama City, and that encompasses Bay, Gulf, and Franklin counties. There are four identified priority areas that are shown in yellow towards the northwest, and these include Tyndall Air Force Base, Crooked Island with the estuaries, and Pine Savannah coastline, as well as a couple others. These were chosen because of their significance in the landscape as natural areas with diverse habitat types that support multitude of species, some of them federal and some state listed. And then there are three priority areas outside the focus area that are shown in green towards the southeast. And during the focus area action strategy stakeholder workshop, there was a lot of lively discussion about these three areas, and that's why we took a second look and we decided to include them, but not extend the focus area itself. So this is the western part of the reach, and it extends from Escambia County to Walton County, and it takes in Pensacola Bay as well as Choctawhatchee Bay. The Pensacola focus area includes 7 priority areas that are scattered both along the ocean front as well as in the back bays. 2 priority areas are outside of the focus area, and they are shown in green. And one is the Perdido River on the west end, and the other is the far east end of Choctawhatchee Bay in Walton County. All these sites were chosen because of unique landscape or diversity of resources within habitats that support multitude of species. With some had listed species, some are endemic species, as well as cultural resources. And there's also the Fort Walton Beach Housing Authority, which is an environmental justice criteria that was a determination for it to be included in our list. There are also significant national security interests of Eglin Air Force Base, Pensacola Naval Station, and Destin U.S. Coast Guard Station within the focus area. And it also includes outstanding Florida waters and the Gulf Islands National Seashore that is managed by the National Park Service. So I chose one representative priority site to discuss, and that is Apalachicola Bay. The estuarine and open water habitat consisting of salt marsh and seagrass beds, along with pine savanna forests, are present, and then it's along extensive natural shoreline. The bay is the designated critical habitat for multiple species that include Gulf sturgeon, piping plover, loggerhead sea turtles, and is also a designated outstanding Florida waters by the state. The south boundary of Apalachicola is a barrier island, and that contains the state park as well as the St. Vincent National Wildlife Refuge. Ecotourism recreational opportunities include Apalachicola National Estuarine Research Reserve. There's also state wildlife management area that is directly inland from the coastline. There's a significant cultural resources that are located along the mouth of the bay and upstream into Apalachicola River. So the vulnerabilities that this priority area faces are coastal erosion and sediment deposition, which could impair water quality that affects seagrass beds, fisheries, and macrofauna. The habitats that support the multiple resources include shorebirds and lists of species, and they are at risk from inundation and saltwater intrusion. Coastal forests are vulnerable to high winds that can uproot or break off trees, as well as erosion and salinity increase causing tree mortality, or those ghost stands that Justin referred to. So are there any questions or comments about Florida?
Kat, I do not see any questions on the Panhandle of Florida. Thank you.
Okay, we can move on then. So now we're going to talk about Alabama. And next slide, please. So the entire coastline of Alabama makes up Reach 14, and it includes Mobile and Baldwin counties. There's one focus area, and that is the Mobile River watershed, and it includes the Mobile-Tensaw River Delta to the north, and the city of Mobile, as well as Mobile Bay Western Shoreline. Within this focus area, there are 5 priority areas, and those are shown in red here. These contain tidally influenced river complexes. The Mobile Tensas River Delta is extensive and contains the diversity of habitat types that make up interconnected ecosystems. Multiple lists of species are supported in the delta. But further down to the south, the Dog River and Fowl River have confluence with the bay, and they contain important resources that transition from freshwater to estuarine wetlands. There's also quite a bit of development in that area in both of those rivers, but believe it or not, there's still some real nice contiguous shoreline that's undisturbed. The 4 identified priority areas that are outside the focus area are the ones that are shown in green towards the mouth of Mobile Bay to the south. These include the Weeks Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve, the Bon Secours National Wildlife Refuge and Bay, and the Fort Morgan Peninsula and Dauphin Island. These areas include unique resources such as the diversity of plant communities. For instance, Bon Secours that has coastal scrub behind dune and beachfront. Weeks Bay NERR provides scientific data collection, educational, and recreational opportunities. Fort Morgan is a National Historic Monument and a fort that predates the Civil War. The phrase "damn the torpedoes" was coined here. Dauphin Island is across the bay to the west and will be a topic of a closer look. So Dauphin Island is a barrier island that is located at the mouth of Mobile Bay. It is the first line of defense from tropical storm systems. In addition to providing recreational opportunities, it also contains educational conservation features such as the Audubon Bird Sanctuary and the Dolphin Sea Lab and Estuarium. There's also significant cultural resources that includes Fort Gaines, which is another fort, and it's on the National Historic Landmark list. Restored dunes and coastal marsh attracts wading birds and shorebirds, and it is an important stopover for wintering migratory birds. Also, Dauphin Island contains critical habitat for piping plover. Extensive beaches attract sea turtle nesting as well. The west end of the island grades into a frequently inundated sand spit with tidal flats, dunes, and coastal marshes. The island is vulnerable to surge wave, erosion, sea level rise, and wind that imperil habitat for lists of species of migratory birds, exposing resources and the species that depend on them. And this was witnessed firsthand about 2 weeks ago with Hurricane Sally. So are there any comments or questions about the Alabama priority environmental areas?
Kat, I do not see any questions about Alabama either. You must be just hitting it out of the park today.
I think so. I actually had a lot of fun putting these slides together because I got to go and take those photos. So now we're going to move on to Mississippi, and the significance about this reach is that it is the last one that you will have to endure for the day for our meeting. So Reach 15, Mississippi, is at the western limit of the SACS study area, and it contains 2 focus areas, Pascagoula, which is along the Alabama state line, and the Biloxi Gulfport, which is to the west. All the priorities are contained within the focus areas. We didn't find any that are outside because you can see the gap between the 2 focus areas is rather small. 5 are within the Pascagoula focus area and 4 are within the Biloxi Gulfport. There's inland sites of freshwater tidal river systems that grade into estuarine habitat towards the Mississippi Sound. And although mostly wetlands, these river systems support multiple federal and listed state species. Grand Bay National Wildlife Refuge is also a National Estuarine Research Reserve and will be discussed in more detail in the next slide. The priority areas within Biloxi and Gulfport focus area also contain an estuarine coastal preserve in the back bay of Biloxi. But Deer Island is a barrier island at the mouth of the bay, and it is currently one of our projects that that the Corps is involved with. This entire area was severely damaged by Hurricane Katrina 15 years ago, and as a result of that storm, several restoration projects were completed, started, or planned as part of the Mississippi Coastal Improvement Program, or what we call MISSIP. So there's one, the Forest Heights Levee, which is off to the left-hand side of the screen, is another environmental justice, cultural, more along a cultural and anthropology criteria for determination. And the reason why is because it was a project that was identified after the Hurricane Katrina during the MISSIP program analyses, but was never funded or it's authorized, but it was never allocated for any kind of work. So that's why it's considered a priority site. It has a very unique history behind it. So I wanted to talk to you guys about Grand Bay, which is a National Wildlife Refuge and also the National Estuarine Research Reserve. It straddles the state line with Alabama, and it extends southwest into the Gulf at Port O'Shane. It has diverse habitat types of pine savanna that grades into estuarine bayous and salt marsh at the interface with salinity. It provides valuable habitat resources for listed species, shorebirds, raptors, and general wildlife. It has a unique landscape features such as salt pans, which are brackish water retaining depressions within the salt marshes, and extensive salt marshes provide habitat for fish nurseries. This priority site is vulnerable to degraded water quality from sediment deposition and algal blooms. Sea level rise, including saltwater intrusion into freshwater forested systems, could result in the pine savanna mortality and conversion to less desirable salt scrub wetland. Also, the open water edge of Grand Bay is the eastern limit of the hypoxic zone along coastal Mississippi and Louisiana. Are there any questions or discussion about Mississippi priority sites? If not, I move it forward to Christina to talk about Puerto Rico.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So I am going to discuss the priority environmental areas for Puerto Rico. The priority environmental areas in Puerto Rico were identified using maps and reports of the Puerto Rico critical wildlife areas, Puerto Rico priority conservation areas, and the protected natural conservation areas, as well as the SACS environmental resources inundation risk analysis. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the priority environmental areas located in Reaches 1 and 2 in Puerto Rico. 4 priority areas were identified in Planning Reach 1, which is located along the northwest coast of Puerto Rico. 3 of the sites are located in the vicinity of the city of Mayaguez. One of these environmental areas, the Rio Calabrinas and floodplains, is located in the Isabela to Rincon focus area. Planning Reach 2, which is located along the north central coast of Puerto Rico, contains 4 priority environmental areas. Next slide, please. So I wanted to highlight one of the priority environmental areas located in Planning Reach 2. It is the area containing the Tiburone Swamp and La Tembladera Pond. And this area contains flush-drain emergent wetlands, scrub shrub wetlands, and forested wetlands. And this area has been recognized as a priority by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Puerto Rico Department of Natural and Environmental Resources. A lot of this area was identified as having a potential high risk to increase storm surge inundation and sea level rise, which could increase the salinity of these areas and potentially convert some of the wetlands from freshwater to estuarine. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the priority environmental areas in Planning Reaches 3 and 4. Planning Reach 3, which is located along the southern coast of Puerto Rico, contains 9 priority environmental areas, and they are scattered throughout this planning reach. 2 of the priority areas are located in the Cabo Rojo focus area. Planning Reach 4, which is located along the northeast coast of Puerto Rico, contains 8 priority environmental areas, and a few of them are grouped together at the northeast tip of the island. Next slide, please. So I wanted to highlight an area located in Planning Reach 3, the Cabo Rojo salt flats and adjacent areas. And this area is also located in the Cabo Rojo focus area. This area contains expanses of salt flats and estuarine open water, and adjacent to the salt flats are areas of mixed forest, scrub, shrub, and grassland. There are also beaches, dunes, and mangroves along the coast in this area. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has categorized this area as a resource category 1, which means it is the highest possible ranking that can be given to a wetland area and considers unique and irreplaceable on a national or eco-regional basis. So the sandy beaches and dunes in this area are at risk to erosion from increased storm surge and wave action, and the estuarine systems are at risk to conversion to open marine waters due to sea level rise. The forests are also at risk to conversion to a more estuarine system from increased storm surge, inundation, and sea level rise. Next slide, please. And are there any questions on the Puerto Rico priority environmental areas?
Christina, I do not see any questions.
Okay. So now I'm going to move on to the areas in the U.S. Virgin Islands. The priority environmental areas, next slide please, Lisa. So the priority environmental areas in the U.S. Virgin Islands were identified using the USGS Geographic Approach to Planning, or the GAP analysis for the U.S. Virgin Islands. And the purpose of this analysis was to provide geographic and ecological information on the status of threatened and endangered species and common species found in the U.S. Virgin Islands. So the GAP analysis was used in conjunction with the SACS inundation risk analysis to identify the priority environmental areas in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Next slide, please. So the U.S. Virgin Islands is divided into 3 planning reaches. Planning Reach 1, which is the island of St. Croix, contains 5 priority environmental areas, 2 of which are located in the Christiansted focus area. Planning Reach 2, which is the island of St. Thomas, contains 4 priority environmental areas. They're pretty much uniformly scattered along the coast in St. Thomas. And Planning Reach 3 is the island of St. John, which contains 3 priority environmental areas. Next slide, please. I wanted to highlight a priority environmental area in Planning Reach 1, which is the island of St. Croix. This is the Krause Lagoon in St. Croix. And this area contains mangroves, estuarine open waters, salt ponds, scrub, shrub, wetlands, beaches, and dunes, as well as grasslands. An industrial complex and oil refinery impacted a lot of the natural areas in the lagoon in the 1960s. However, the remaining areas provide habitat for waterfowl and other wildlife. The beaches and dunes in this area are at risk to erosion from increased storm surge and wave action, and the wetlands area are at risk to conversion to more of a marine environment due to increased storm surge and sea level rise. And that is all I have for the U.S. Virgin Islands. Are there any questions?
Yes, there's a couple. I guess one, they're missing the Great Pond on St. Croix.
Great. Okay.
Okay. And do offshore islands count like Buck Island on St. Croix?
Offshore islands do count, and I will have to pass that on to Jason Hales to look at, who wrote up the Puerto Rico and U.S. Virgin Islands state appendices. So these are really good ideas that I can pass.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, the offshore islands would count, and quite a few of the priority environmental areas were intended to include the islands outside in adjacent to them. And then for the question, there's a Ruth K. I see, and Great Pond. We tried to include the largest areas of environmental risk, somewhat limiting the number, but those resources would also be at risk and could be included in the priority list. Hope that helps answer the question.
Thanks, Jason. Appreciate that. It looks like there's a second vote for Great Pond.
Okay.
So, we have a few things in the chat box to consider as we do the write-ups, some things to explain or to take a second look at, which is exactly why we had this meeting today. So we appreciate all this great feedback. But I don't see any other specific questions to either the Virgin Islands or Puerto Rico. So I think we're good to continue on.
So next steps, like I said before, measures and strategies to address risk for the priority environmental areas located within focus areas may be developed as part of the SACS focus area action strategies. All the priority environmental areas, even if they're located outside of a focus area, will be included as SACS recommendations for follow-on studies or actions. The slides and the webinar recording will be posted to the SACS website. We need about 10 days to do that, so we will be sending out a follow-up email with that link. Descriptions of the priority environmental areas will be provided to our stakeholders for feedback, so we did not get a chance due to time to really go through every single priority environmental area. We wanted to pick out a few examples for you so that you could see how we identified those areas. But we do have write-ups for all of the areas, and we will be sending those out to our stakeholders for feedback. In the long term, the SACS draft report will be available for public review in October of 2021. So how can you provide feedback on the priority environmental areas? We will be sending out, like I said, the descriptions of all the priority environmental areas, and we did get really good feedback today. So you could reach out to the SACS environmental team. The environmental team email addresses will be provided in a follow-up email and on the last slide of this presentation. You can also send comments to our SACS email address. And if you would like any additional information on the study, that can be found on our website. And like I said before, if you're interested in taking a look at the Environmental Resources web mapping application, the link is there, and we will include this link in our follow-up email. And are there any additional questions or discussions?
I do not see anything else. That's all I see in the discussion box.
Okay. So I want to thank everybody for attending today's webinar. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to the team. Our contact information is located here. So I would like to thank everyone for participating, giving us great feedback on our webinar today. Thank you.